I guess the first question I had for you is why cartoons? You clearly love cartoons,
I do.
and
The
why?
immediacy of them is one thing. I think they make history so much more interesting for kids who don't like to read. And most kids today don't like to read. Like, they like movies, they like TikTok and all that kind of stuff. But the other reason to use them in the classroom is because kids are terrible at reading cartoons.
Right.
And so these are visual primary sources. And as I tried to mention at a couple of points, they're just layered with all kinds of suggestions about the past and how people felt about the past. Okay, how do you teach kids to take them apart? So I have found in working with teachers that if you use like 4 or 5 of these cartoons with your students and use like a decoding the cartoon sheet like we have at the National Archives website, you can really teach the kids to build their critical thinking skills by getting them to look. And so it's that process of history as detective work and how you can cultivate your kids to be those folks who take a close look. I think that's why I like to use them. So they're fun and they're useful.
Right, right. But they can be complicated because oftentimes, and some of the ones you showed, I mean, they're filled with irony, right? And
They are.
and and
And
lots of references. They're rich
yeah,
with
exactly.
references.
And they're like jokes, from the 50s. And it's like that old line, well, you had to be there. To some extent, that's true. But when you look at a few of them, you start to get inside that conversation. And when you use a few of them from the same cartoonist, they will repeat the same kinds of motifs and make the same kind of references. And so then, you sort of start to get those jokes and you sort of start to get those references. But see, the past has got to be, as you always tell your students, it has to be this foreign country or else it's boring. And so these cartoons are just foreign enough that they really like force us to work just hard enough to get them that they're a challenge.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Charlie, have you ever used cartoons that were not from the U.S.? Because I think one of the challenges, at least I confront in the classroom, is a lot of students have never thought about the United States from a non-American point of view, and that
Right.
can also mean from a Native American. When I say
Yeah.
non-American, I mean a non-mainstream American point of view.
Yes. No, I understand what you're saying. And I have not personally, but I think that would be, particularly in the Cold War,
Right.
I think that would be a fantastic opportunity, again, to build on all the things I was just talking about, to juxtapose those two images from different points of view.
Right, right. That makes a lot of sense. So far, we don't have any questions from the teachers. I think they're just overwhelmed with the material. So I'll keep asking you
Okay.
questions because I have a lot of questions for you. But I just want to encourage the teachers if they want to come in. I'm excited to learn from you, and I'm sure my questions are relevant for them. When you think about the Cold War, Charlie, especially now, we have a generation of students who have no connection to the Cold War. I grew up, in the 1980s were a key moment for me in my life. The Iran hostage crisis, all of that, Reagan and drop off. Our students have no connection to the Cold War. And I sometimes worry that it seems, even in these cartoons, in fact, it can have the effect of making them think it was absurd. And maybe there was an absurd element to it. What are your suggestions for helping them understand the levels of fear, the anxiety, the uncertainty that surrounded, for example, the Korean War or the Cuban
Yeah.
Missile Crisis?
Yeah.
How do you
Because
suggest recreating that?
it was a long time ago. One of the documents that you might want to think about that gets at William Faulkner won the Nobel Prize in 1952, I think it was, and he gave a speech at the time, and he says, the number one fear of modern people is the worry, when will I be blown up?
Yeah, yeah,
And this notion that you can have a weapon that can go across the ocean and hit the United States and cause unfathomable destruction
yes,
was such a new idea that people were just blown away by it. The other dimension of it is the idea of subversion, that people were really frightened of that. And there, I think, showing them perhaps the horror movies, a little bit of the horror movies of the 1950s, because there's such a great fear about things that could take over your mind.
right, right.
And so you got this twin fear of actual physical danger of getting blown up, but then this other one of getting subverted. And would America still be America?
Right.
And so, I think that somehow using popular culture to get at those two ideas and the popular culture of the early 50s. So if you look at old like um, magazine ads and stuff from then, you can see that. Oh, and as one of the teachers just suggested, yeah, have them hide under their desk and duck and cover. David Halberstam's, I don't know if it's still available, but he made this incredible video of his book, The 50s.
50s. I
And
remember seeing that.
in
Yeah.
the first issue, he has an issue in there on the Cold War, and it has a lot about, the fear of the bomb. And I think if you can get a hold of that, show the kids clips of that. It shows air raids in New York City and stuff like that, and kids hiding their heads under their desks. You have to really work at getting them to feel how frightening it was.
Yes, I think that's right. That's been my experience of that every year. It's harder and harder to get them to feel that,
Yeah.
and for them to experience. I think music also helps.
Yeah.
When I lecture on the 1980s, now again, those were my teenage years, but Stings, Do the Russians Love Their Children Too, right? And all the songs about nuclear and fears of nuclear war in the early 1980s. You could argue that was actually one of the great motifs of rock and roll. Then, if the civil rights movement was the motif in the anti-war movement of the 60s and 70s, nuclear fear was the one of the 1980s.
And the other thing, I guess, for the kids to understand is that perhaps the interest in suburbia and the escapism of rock and roll was to get away from some of that anxiety.
Right. And Teresa Russo is pointing out, we had some other suggestions from John Underwood of The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is a great film. Teresa is reflecting on her mother's experience as a child during World War II and air raid drills, and how that fear never left her, just as those who lived through the Depression never lost the fear of becoming bankrupt. Those who lived through World War II, I think, never lost the fear of an air raid or something coming from the sky.
Yeah.
But I think John Underwood's point that he just put in the chat is very well stated, that students don't really have a concept of the United States having a true enemy, or an enemy that could do such grave damage to us. Terrorism is a different kind of thing. Terrorism is dangerous and scary, but terrorists are not going to destroy the United States.
Right.
This is a different level, and it's hard to get that across to students. It's also hard to get that across to them, the relief that came when the Cold War ended also.
Yeah, and I think, the suggestions I'm seeing in the chat box are absolutely wonderful. So I urge everybody to, save that chat when we finish, because there's a lot of good suggestions for you to take to your classroom.
Absolutely. So Sam is reminding me